All right, so we've looked at the types of data. Now we're going to look at some ways to collect the data. So we're really going to be talking about experiments and observational studies today. And when we're looking at individuals that are to be studied, we call that experimental units. It could be people, animals, plants, or things. When the experimental units are people, they are sometimes called subjects of an experiment. The outcome or response is what we measured on each experimental unit. Treatments are the procedures applied to each experimental unit. So suppose that scientists want to determine which of 3 types of seed will result in the largest wheat yield. The study is conducted as follows. Prepare 3 identically sized plots of land with similar soil. Plant each type of seed on a different plot, choosing the plots at random. Water and fertilize the plots in the same way. Harvest the wheat and measure the amount grown on each plot. If one type of seed produces substantially more or less wheat than the others, then that one is clearly better or worse than the others. So our experimental units were the plots of land. The treatment was the type of seed. And the outcome is that amount of growth. Now you do want to keep your experiments randomized. A randomized experiment is a study in which the investigator assigns treatments to the experimental units at random. To assess the effectiveness of a new method for teaching arithmetic to elementary school children, a simple random sample of 30 first graders were taught with the new method, and another simple random sample of 30 first graders were taught with the currently used method. At the end of the 8 weeks, the children were given a test to assess their knowledge. What are the treatments, and why is this randomized experiment? So the treatments were the 2 methods of teaching. And why would this be considered a randomized experiment? The children were assigned to the treatment groups, at random. Everybody had an equal chance of being selected and for being part of each group. Now, an observational study is one in which the assignment to treatment groups is not made by the investigator. A study is performed to determine how smoking affects people's health. A group of smokers and a group of non-smokers are observed for several years. Scientists observe differences in health outcomes between the group of smokers and non-smokers. Why is this an observational study? Well, it's an observational study because they weren't assigned a treatment. The subjects chose their own treatment, their own group Now, we talked about randomized experiments. Why randomize? In a perfect study, treatment groups would not differ from each other in any important way, except that they receive treatments, right? In practice, it is impossible to construct treatment groups that are exactly alike, but randomization does the next best thing. In a randomized experiment, small differences among treatment groups are likely to be only due to chance. If there are large differences, in outcomes among the treatment groups, we can conclude that the differences are due to the treatments. Scientists reported the results of a study to determine whether a new drug called, I can't pronounce it, is effective in reducing levels of virus in patients with HIV. These patients were divided into two groups, where one group was given the drug and the other group was given a placebo. In the group that got the drug, 62% of the subjects had reduced levels of virus, but only 35% of the placebo group did. Because this study was a randomized experiment, it is reasonable to conclude that the difference was actually due to the drug. Because that is a pretty high percentage. Now, sometimes an experiment can be considered double blind. A double blind is when neither the investigator nor the subjects know who has been assigned to which treatment. When the investigators or subjects know which treatment is being given, they may tend to report the results differently. Therefore, experiments should be double-blinded whenever possible. Now, next thing we want to talk about is something called confounding. Observational studies are less reliable. Imagine an observational study that is intended to determine whether smoking increases the risk of heart attack. A group of smokers and non-smokers are observed for several years, and during that time, a higher percentage of the smoking group experiences a heart attack. One problem with this type of study is that the smoking group will differ from the non-smoking group in many other ways other than just the smoking. For example, smoking is more prevalent among men. So the smoking group will contain a higher percentage of men than the non-smoking group. Men generally are at a higher risk of heart attack than women. Therefore, the higher rate of heart attacks in the smoking group may just be due to the fact that there's more men there and not to the smoking itself. The preceding example illustrates a major problem with observational studies. It is difficult to tell whether a difference in the outcome is due to the treatment or some other difference between the treatment and control groups. This is known as confounding. In an observational study of the effects of blood pressure on health, a large group of people of all ages were given regular blood pressure checkups for a period of 1 year. It was found that people with high blood pressure were more likely to develop cancer than people with lower blood pressure. Why could this be considered confounding? Well, it was all ages. Age can be a factor. Older people tend to have higher blood pressure than younger people, and older people are more likely to get cancer than younger people. So it could be not just the blood pressure, but age could be a factor. We're also not considering any other things that could be a factor. So that could lead to confounding results. Now let's talk about the types of observational studies. There are two main types of observational studies: cohort studies and case control. Now, the cohort studies can be further divided into prospective, cross-sectional, and retrospective. In a prospective cohort study, a group of subjects is studied to determine whether various factors of interest are associated with an outcome. Actually, that's true with any cohort study. A prospective cohort study specifically is one where the subjects are followed over time. One of the most famous prospective studies is the Framingham Heart Study. This study began in 1948 with 5,209 men and women from the town of Framingham, Massachusetts. Every 2 years, these subjects are given physical exams and lifestyle interviews, which are studied to discover factors that increase the risk of heart disease. So prospective is studied over time. Cross-sectional is one where measurements are taken at one point in time. An example of this is a study published by the Journal of the American Medical Association by I. Lang and his colleagues. They studied the heart effects of bisphenol A, a chemical found in the linings of food and beverage containers. They measured the levels of this in urine samples from 1,455 adults and found that people with higher levels of bisphenol are more likely to have heart disease and diabetes. So notice it wasn't over time. They just chose one point in time to do the study. In a retrospective, subjects are sampled after the outcome has occurred. For example, in a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, T. Adams and colleagues sampled 9,949 people who had undergone gastric bypass surgery between 5 and 15 years previously, along with 9,668 obese patients that had not had bypass surgery. They looked back in time to see which patients were still alive. They found that the survival rates for the surgery patients was greater than if they had not undergone the surgery. So retrospective is occurring after something happened. Prospective is following over time, and cross-sectional is one moment in time. Now let's talk about case control studies. In a case control study, Two samples are drawn. One sample consists of people who have the disease of interest, the cases, and the other consists of people who do not. They're called the control group. The investigators look back in time to determine whether a factor of interest differs between the two groups. So S.S. Nielsen and colleagues conducted a case control study to determine whether exposure to pesticides is related to brain cancer in children. They sampled 201 children who had been diagnosed with brain cancer and 285 children who did not. They interviewed the parents of the children to estimate the extent to which the children had been exposed to pesticides. They did not find a clear relationship. One of the most famous prospective cohort studies in the Framingham Heart Study, this study began in 1948 and with the 5,209 men and women from that town. Every 2 years, these subjects were given well, my goodness, I repeated this paragraph. We already talked about that.